Only a single cup of cornmeal remained. Clara stared at the meager ration, calculating how many days she had before the bitter cold took what hunger didn't, while the wind howled like a starved dog against the cabin walls. When a heavy thud rattled the door, she knew it couldn't be a neighbor. The nearest lived 20 miles down the ridge. It was Levi. He was a man carved from the very mountain that had buried her husband. When he finally broke the silence, his words hit harder than the winter frost. "Marry me," he whispered. Through her tears, she could only nod. The ground in Wyoming didn't freeze. It turned to iron. Clara learned that the day she tried to bury Henry. She had swung the pickaxe until her hands bled through her wool mittens, the wooden handle slick with her own blood. The earth hadn't yielded. In the end, she dragged his stiff, wasted body to a shallow depression behind the tree line and covered him with heavy river stones so the wolves wouldn't get him. She didn't pray. The sky was a flat, bruised purple, and it looked completely empty. God had stayed back east. Henry had been a romantic, a clerk from Boston who read too many dime novels about the frontier and decided a man's worth was measured by the acreage he could tame. He bought the land sight unseen. He didn't know how to swing an axe properly. He didn't know that pine burned too fast and oak was needed for the long nights. He didn't know that a scratch from a rusted nail could fester and turn a man's blood to poison in a week. Clara had watched him die in a fever dream, sweating through the thin blankets as the first blizzard of November sealed them in. Now it was January. The cabin was 12 feet by 12 feet of drafty logs and mud chinking that crumbled when the wind hit it right. Clara spent her days in a numb routine. Wake, feed the dying fire, melt snow for water, stare at the small burlap sack of cornmeal, sleep, repeat. She was 25, but the small mirror over the wash basin showed a woman of 40. Her cheekbones were sharp enough to cut glass. Her eyes, once a bright, hopeful hazel, had washed out to the color of dirty ice. She had stopped crying in December. Tears froze on your face and cracked your skin. Cynicism was warmer. It was a Tuesday, or maybe Wednesday, when the smoke stopped rising from her chimney. She had run out of dry wood and was too weak to drag the damp logs from the edge of the clearing. She wrapped herself in every blanket she owned and sat in the rocking chair listening to the silence creeping into the room. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. Then a shadow blocked the pale light struggling through the single frosted window. Clara didn't move toward the rifle. She didn't have the strength to lift it, let alone steady the barrel. If it was a drifter, he could have the cabin. The door didn't open. Instead, a rhythmic, violent sound echoed from the side of the house. Thwack. Crack. Someone was chopping wood. She sat there for an hour listening to the steady, unhurried rhythm. Finally, the heavy wooden door pushed open, scraping against the ice on the floorboards. He didn't step in immediately. He stood in the doorway, a massive silhouette against the blinding white of the snow. He was draped in buckskin and heavy furs, snow clinging to his thick, dark beard. Levi. She knew him only in passing. He was a trapper who lived high up in the Bighorn Range, coming down to the outpost twice a year to trade pelts for powder and salt. Henry had once tried to strike up a conversation with him about the scenery. Levi had looked at Henry as if he were a talking horse, grunted and walked away. Levi stepped inside, bringing the biting cold with him. He dropped an armful of split, dry oak onto the hearth. Without a word to her, he knelt, pulled a tin of dry matches and a handful of birch bark from his coat, and built a fire. The flames caught. The crackle was the loudest sound in the room. Heat bloomed, pushing back the damp chill. Clara watched him from the chair. "Why are you here?" Her voice was a dry rasp, unused for weeks. Levi didn't look up. He stayed crouched by the fire, holding his large, scarred hands out to the flames. "Saw no smoke," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like stones grinding together. "I ran out of wood." I saw. He stood up. He was tall, scraping the low rafters of the cabin. His eyes were a pale, startling gray, scanning the room. They landed on the empty tin plates, the frost on the inside of the walls, and finally on her. There was no pity in his gaze. Out here, pity was an insult. It meant you thought someone was weak, and weak things died. He just looked at her with a stark, calculating assessment. He walked back out the door. Clara thought he was leaving. A brief, sharp spike of panic hit her, followed by a dull wave of resignation. But he came back a minute later carrying a frozen haunch of meat. Venison. He dropped it on the small wooden table. He pulled a heavy hunting knife from his belt and began carving thin slices, laying them out in a cast-iron skillet. "You're starving," he stated. It wasn't a question. "My husband died," she said, as if that explained the hunger, the cold, the sheer failure of it all. "I know. Found the rock pile out back." He set the skillet over the fire. The smell of searing meat hit the air, rich and heavy. Clara's stomach contracted violently. She gripped the arms of the rocking chair to keep from lurching forward like a wild dog. Levi didn't offer her platitudes. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss." He just cooked the meat, handed her a tin plate, and sat on a wooden crate across the room, eating his own portion in silence. Clara ate. She forced herself to chew slowly, though her body screamed to swallow it whole. The grease coated her mouth warm and life-giving. For the first time in 2 months, the cynical voice in her head was quieted by the simple, brutal reality of survival. When she finished, she looked at the mountain man. He was staring into the fire. "I don't have money to pay you for the meat," she said flatly. "Or the wood." Levi turned his head slowly. "Didn't ask for any." He stayed for 3 days. The storm that had been brewing over the peaks finally broke, hammering the valley with a fury that made the cabin timbers groan. Clara didn't ask him to stay, and he didn't ask permission. It was a silent understanding forged by the weather. A man caught in a whiteout died, no matter how thick his furs were. The dynamic in the small space shifted. Before the cabin had been a tomb, now it was a shelter. Levi took up space, not just physically, but with a quiet, deliberate presence. He didn't pace, he didn't fidget. He possessed the stillness of a predator waiting in the brush. On the second day, the wind tore a section of the oiled paper from the window. Snow blasted in like buckshot. Clara scrambled out of her blankets, shivering violently, trying to shove a towel into the gap. Her numb fingers fumbled. Levi was there in a second. He gently but firmly pushed her aside. He took a piece of scrap wood from the corner, grabbed his knife, and began to whittle it down to size. Clara stood back, arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching him. He smelled of wood smoke, pine pitch, and old leather. It was a distinctly masculine scent, but vastly different from Henry. Henry had smelled of bay rum and anxiety. Levi smelled like the mountain itself. He hammered the board over the window with the heavy handle of his knife, sealing the draft. "Thank you," she muttered, returning to her chair by the fire. He grunted, returning to his spot on the floor near the hearth, where he spent hours meticulously oiling his rifle and repairing his snowshoes. Clara found herself studying him when he wasn't looking. The cynical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive in the ruthless East Coast slums before Henry rescued her, was working overtime. Men didn't do favors, not for free. What was his angle? Did he want the land? The land was worthless. Did he want her? She scoffed internally. "Look at me," she thought. "I'm a bag of bones in a filthy dress." "Why do you live up there?" she asked suddenly. The silence had grown too heavy, pressing against her eardrums. Levi stopped running the oiled rag over his rifle barrel. He didn't look up immediately. He seemed to weigh the question, turning it over in his mind like a strange coin. "Fewer people," he said finally. "Is that a good thing?" He looked at her, his gray eyes catching the firelight. People complicate things. They lie, they steal, they build things where they shouldn't. He glanced around the poorly built cabin. A mountain doesn't lie. If it kills you, it's because you made a mistake, not because it hated you. It was the most he had spoken at one time. The words were harsh, a direct indictment of Henry's foolishness. But Clara didn't feel the urge to defend her dead husband. Levi was right. So you just live up there alone, waiting to not make a mistake. Levi resumed oiling the rifle. I trap, I eat, I live. Sounds lonely. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly beneath the beard. Loneliness won't freeze you to death. Stupidity will. That stung. She shut her mouth and turned her face to the fire. They didn't speak for the rest of the day. By the third morning, the wind died down. The sun broke through the gray overcast, reflecting off the fresh snow with a blinding, painful brilliance. The world outside was perfectly still, buried under 3 feet of new powder. Levi packed his gear. He moved efficiently, strapping his snowshoes to his pack, securing his bedroll. Clara watched him from the table, a cold dread pooling in her stomach. The meat he had brought would last her another week if she rationed it. The wood he chopped might last 10 days. And then what? The snow wouldn't melt until late April. She had no money, no skills to trap, no horse to ride to town. She was going to die here. The realization didn't come with a frantic panic, but with a slow, sinking resignation. Henry had dug her grave when he bought this plot. He just hadn't lived long enough to push her in. She watched Levi pull his heavy coat on. She wanted to beg him to stay. She wanted to ask him to take her with him. But her pride, the only thing she had left that wasn't frozen or starving, locked her jaw. She wouldn't be a beggar. Levi walked to the door. He put his hand on the wooden latch. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her. The silence stretched, pulling taut. Levi didn't open the door. His hand remained on the iron latch, his knuckles white with tension. For a man who moved with absolute certainty, he looked for a fraction of a second entirely unsure. He turned slowly. He didn't walk back into the center of the room, keeping his distance, putting the length of the small cabin between them. "You can't stay here," he said. The gravel in his voice was rougher than usual. Clara stared at her hands resting on the rough grain of the table. "I know. Spring thaw is 3 months away. You'll run out of wood in 10 days. You're too weak to haul logs, and there's no game down in this valley anyway. The wolves pushed them out." He was laying out the facts like a coroner detailing a fatal wound. "I am aware of my situation, Mr. Harlan." She snapped, a sudden flare of anger cutting through her lethargy. "You don't need to read me my death warrant before you leave." Levi didn't flinch. He just watched her, absorbing her anger without a word. "I have a cabin," he said. "Higher up. Ridgeline. Built it myself. Solid timber double chink. Wind doesn't get in." Clara frowned, confused by the shift. "Good for you." "Got a root cellar, salted pork, dried elk, enough potatoes to make it to June, cast iron stove that burns hot." He listed his assets mechanically, staring at the wall just above her head. "Why are you telling me this?" Her heart began to beat a little faster, a strange rhythm against her ribs. Levi finally met her eyes. The stark, unyielding gray was suddenly full of something else. Not pity, not lust. It looked incredibly like exhaustion. "I told you I moved up there because people complicate things," he said slowly, choosing each word with agonizing care. "I liked the quiet, liked knowing exactly what the day held." He dropped his hand from the latch, letting his arm hang heavy at his side. "But 20 years is a long time to listen to your own breathing." He took one step toward her, then another. He stopped a few feet away, towering over the table. "You're a survivor. I saw you looking at that dead land out there. You didn't cry. You didn't curse God. You just calculated the odds. He paused, his chest rising and falling beneath the heavy furs. I need someone to watch the fire when I'm on the trap line. Someone to talk to when the snow traps me inside for 2 weeks straight. Someone to be there. Clara stopped breathing. The crackle of the dying fire sounded like a roaring avalanche in the small room. I don't have anything to give you, she whispered, her cynical defense mechanism automatically throwing up a shield. I have no money. I don't know how to skin a buck. I don't know how to live in the mountains. I didn't ask for a trapper, he replied. I can teach you what you need to know. He reached into his pocket and pulled something out. He placed it on the table between them. It was a simple hammered copper ring, uneven, unpolished. He must have made it himself, sitting alone by his cast-iron stove. I ain't a romantic man, Levi said, his voice dropping to a low, raw pitch. I won't write you poems. I won't promise you an easy life. Life up there is hard. It's brutal. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance. But you will never freeze. You will never starve. And you will never be alone. Clara stared at the copper ring. It caught the dim firelight, glowing like a tiny ember on the scarred wood. She thought of Henry's grave. She thought of the biting cold, the gnawing hunger, the terror of waking up to absolute silence. Then she looked up at Levi. His face was a mask of stoic endurance, but his eyes were entirely vulnerable. He was risking his solitude, his carefully constructed fortress against the world. For her. It wasn't a fairy tale rescue. It was a partnership born of desperation, respect, and a profound, shared loneliness. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing. Marry me, the lonely mountain man whispered. The dam broke. The cynicism, the numbness, the ice that had encased her heart for months shattered in an instant. The tears she hadn't been able to shed for her dead husband, for her ruined life, for her own starvation, flooded her eyes. They spilled over her sharp cheekbones, hot and blinding. She didn't have the breath to speak. She didn't need to. Clara reached out her trembling, scarred fingers, brushing against his massive, calloused hand. She picked up the copper ring, and looking up into the face of the man who was offering her life in exchange for companionship, the widow could only nod through her tears. Leaving the cabin took less than an hour. Clara had almost nothing to pack. 2 wool dresses frayed at the hems, a brush with half its boar bristles missing, a daguerreotype of her mother, the silver plate tarnished at the edges. Levi did not tell her to pack light. He simply handed her a pair of battered snowshoes, the gut webbing stiff and yellowed. He knelt in the doorway, ignoring the biting wind that whipped around his broad shoulders, and strapped them securely to her boots. His hands moved with practiced, brutal efficiency. He didn't ask if they were too tight. Loose snowshoes meant a broken ankle, and a broken ankle up here meant death. Step high, was all he said. Follow my tracks. Put your foot exactly where I put mine. They stepped out into the blinding white. Clara did not look back at the shallow grave behind the tree line. The dead did not feel the cold. The ascent was an exercise in pure, agonizing repetition. The mountain did not care about her grief, her empty stomach, or the copper ring hidden beneath her patched wool mittens. The incline was sheer, a relentless upward grade through dense stands of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. Levi broke trail. He was a machine built of muscle and bone, moving with a steady, rhythmic plunging motion that threw up plumes of dry powder. He created a trench in the waist-deep snow, pressing the path down so Clara wouldn't have to fight the drift. It was the most profound act of care she had ever experienced. Henry would have written a poem about the beauty of the snow while letting her freeze. Levi just kicked the snow out of her way. By the second hour, her lungs felt lined with shattered glass. Each breath was a ragged, shallow gasp. The cold air burned her throat, and the muscles in her thighs screamed in violent protest. She stumbled, her left snowshoe catching the edge of a buried root. She went down hard, face first, into the freezing powder. The snow packed into her collar, melting instantly against her sweating neck. She lay there for a second. The urge to simply close her eyes and let the white swallow her was an intoxicating, heavy narcotic. It would be so easy. The crunch of snowshoes stopped. Levi turned. He didn't rush back. He walked down the incline with deliberate steps towering over her prone form. He didn't offer his hand. "Get up," he said. The words weren't cruel, but they held no sympathy. Sympathy was a luxury of the lowlands. Clara pushed herself up, spitting snow. Her cheek was scraped raw from the icy crust. She glared at him, a sudden hot spike of fury piercing her exhaustion. She hated him for a moment, hated his strength, hated his uncompromising stare, hated the fact that he was right. She planted her poles, forced her screaming legs to straighten, and stood. Levi watched her. He gave a single short nod. He turned his back and resumed breaking trail. They climbed for another 3 hours. The sun began its short arc behind the western ridge, casting long, violet shadows across the snow. The temperature plummeted. Just as Clara felt her knees threatening to buckle permanently, the trees broke. Levi's cabin sat on a wide, flat bench of granite, backed up against a sheer rock face that protected it from the northern gales. It was not picturesque. It was a fortress. The logs were massive, thick as a man's torso stripped of bark and notched with perfect, airtight precision. The roof was pitched steep to shed snow, the cedar shakes heavy and dark. Levi unlatched the heavy timber door and pushed it open. Clara stepped inside. The space was completely dark, but the smell hit her instantly. It was a dense, rich aroma of cured tobacco wood ash, oiled leather, and the heavy metallic tang of dried blood and raw earth. It smelled like survival. Levi struck a match. He touched it to a kerosene lantern hanging from a central beam. Yellow light spilled across the room. It was a single large room, twice the size of her old cabin. The floors were tightly fitted planking, swept clean. Against the far wall sat a massive black cast iron stove, its belly cold, but radiating a faint residual memory of heat. Above it, thick slabs of salted pork and strings of dried, shriveled venison hung from the rafters. The left wall was lined with traps, iron jaws gaping open, chains coiled neatly on pegs. In the back corner was a bed frame built of raw birch logs, piled high with thick gray wolf pelts and a heavy wool blanket. Levi walked straight to the stove. He opened the iron door, threw in a handful of pitch pine kindling, and struck another match. The fire caught with a low roar, the draft pulling the smoke cleanly up the heavy iron pipe. He turned to her. She was standing awkwardly by the door, shivering violently as the adrenaline of the climb bled out of her system. "Take your boots off," he ordered, pointing to a rough-hewn bench near the fire. "Rub your feet. Keep the blood moving." Clara hobbled to the bench. Her hands shook so badly she could barely untie the frozen leather laces. Levi watched her struggle for a moment, then crossed the room. He knelt, batting her hands away, and unlaced the boots himself. He pulled them off along with her damp woolen socks. Her toes were white, cold as marble. Levi took her bare feet in his massive, calloused hands. He didn't rub them. That would tear the frozen tissue. He simply cupped them, letting the natural furnace of his body heat transfer to her skin. He didn't look up at her. He kept his eyes on her feet. "You did good," he said softly. Clara stared at the top of his dark, unkempt head. The heat from his hands was slowly bringing a painful, prickling throb back to her toes. The cynical voice in her head tried to find the catch, the hidden cost of this warmth. It found nothing, just the crackle of the iron stove, the heavy silence of the mountain, and the weight of a man keeping his promise. The first 2 weeks were an exercise in learning a new language, not a spoken one. Levi rarely used 10 words when a grunt or a gesture would suffice, but a language of movement and utility. Their arrangement was aggressively practical. The romance of the copper ring had ended the moment they crossed the threshold. There were no declarations of affection. There was only the work. The first night, Levi had pointed to the bed in the corner. "Yours," he had said. He then unrolled a heavy canvas tarp and a buffalo robe on the floor near the stove. Clara had started to protest, the ingrained, polite society of her upbringing surfacing for a brief, ridiculous moment. Levi had silenced her with a look. "Heat rises, but the floor stays warm next to the iron. I sleep lighter. Need to be near the door. You sleep in the bed." There was no room for argument. Clara took the bed, sinking into the wolf pelts, smelling the wild, musky scent of the fur. She slept for 14 hours straight. When she woke, Levi was gone. The fire was roaring, and a tin pot of coffee sat on the edge of the stove. A freshly skinned snowshoe hare lay on the wooden prep table next to a sharp skinning knife. A silent instruction. Clara had never gutted an animal. Henry had always traded for their meat in town, sickened by the sight of blood. She stared at the slick, purple muscle and the glazed eyes of the rabbit. Her stomach rolled. She closed her eyes, remembering the gnawing, hollow ache of starvation down in the valley. She picked up the knife. When Levi returned at dusk, his beard caked in frost and 2 marten pelts slung over his shoulder, he found the rabbit quartered and simmering in an iron pot with dried onions and snow melt. He looked at the pot, then at the clean wooden table, and finally at Clara. She was sitting by the fire, wiping the blade of the knife with a rag. He gave that single, short nod, the highest praise he offered. They established a rhythm, a geography of solitude where 2 people occupied a small space without colliding. Levi checked his short trap lines in the mornings, chopped wood, and repaired gear. Clara tended the stove, cooked melted snow for drinking water, and began the arduous process of learning how to scrape and stretch the hides he brought back. It was brutal, foul-smelling work. The first time she scraped a beaver pelt, her hands cramped so violently she dropped the bone tool. The smell of fat and raw flesh made her gag. Levi had stopped oiling his rifle, walked over and picked up the scraper. He stood behind her, placing his large hands over hers, guiding the angle of the blade against the hide. "Too steep, you cut the skin," he murmured, his chest rumbling against her back. "Too shallow, you leave the fat. It rots. 45 degrees. Push with the shoulder, not the wrist." His breath was warm against her ear. It was an entirely practical lesson, devoid of any intentional intimacy, yet the sheer physical proximity sent a jolt down her spine. He smelled of pine resin and cold air. She adjusted her grip, leaned into the stroke, and a long ribbon of yellow fat curled away from the skin. He stepped back immediately. "Keep going." Her cynicism, the sharp, defensive edge she had honed over the last year, began to dull. You couldn't be cynical about a man who chopped cords of wood so you wouldn't freeze. You couldn't be bitter towards someone who gave you the best cuts of meat and ate the gristle himself. He asked nothing of her body. He never lingered near the bed. He stripped down to his long johns to wash at the basin without a hint of modesty, treating his heavily scarred body as nothing more than a tool that needed maintenance. Clara learned to look away, giving him the privacy the single room denied them. One evening in late February, a storm trapped them inside for 3 days. The wind shrieked around the eaves, a physical force threatening to tear the roof off. They sat near the stove. The silence stretched, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of the valley cabin. It was comfortable, thick. Clara was mending a tear in one of his heavy wool shirts. Levi was carving a new handle for an axe. "Why did you leave?" she asked quietly, biting off a piece of heavy cotton thread. Levi didn't stop carving. Wood shavings curled off his knife, dropping to the floor. "Leave wherever you came from before the mountain." He went still for a moment. He tested the edge of the knife with his thumb. "Maine," he said finally. "I had a farm. A brother." He didn't offer more. Clara waited, letting the crackle of the fire fill the space. She had learned not to push. He would give what he wanted to give. "War broke out," he continued, his voice dropping into that low, gravelly register. "Brother went south. I went north. Met him again at Shiloh." Clara stopped sewing. The needle hovered over the fabric. "I was a sharpshooter," Levi said flatly. He looked up, staring into the bright orange coals visible through the stove's draft vent. Through a spyglass, a man's face is real clear. Even at 300 yards, real clear. He closed the knife with a sharp snap. "After the surrender, I walked west. Kept walking until I couldn't see any more faces. Just trees." He stood up, brushing the wood shavings from his lap. He walked to the water bucket, took a tin dipper, and drank. He didn't look at her again. He didn't need pity, and he certainly didn't want absolution. He had just stated a fact. Clara looked down at the heavy wool shirt in her lap. She smoothed her hand over the fabric. "My father drank away our money in Boston," she said, her voice steady. "Sold me to Henry for a gambling debt. Henry called it a dowry. I came west because I had a choice between a romantic fool or the gutters of the North End." Levi turned from the water bucket. He looked at her, his pale gray eyes assessing, weighing her truth against his own. He walked back and sat down. He picked up the axe head and the newly carved handle. "Mountain doesn't care about Boston," he said. "Doesn't care about Shiloh. It only cares if the fire is lit." Clara picked up her needle. She pierced the heavy wool, pulling the thread tight. "Then we keep it lit," she said. March brought a false spring. The sun glared down with a sudden vicious intensity, turning the top layer of snow into heavy, wet slush during the day, only to freeze it into treacherous, glass-slick ice overnight. It was the most dangerous time of the year. The mountain was waking up, hungry and unpredictable. Levi had gone down to the creek to chop ice. They needed water, and the snow was getting too dirty to melt for drinking. He had been gone longer than usual. Clara was at the stove, rendering down bear fat into tallow for candles. The cabin smelled thick and heavy. She heard the heavy thud against the door before she heard his footsteps. She wiped her hands on her apron and pulled the latch. Levi practically fell into the room. He caught himself on the doorframe, his massive frame sagging. His face was the color of dirty chalk, his lips a thin, tight line of suppressed agony. "Levi?" He didn't speak. He limped forward, dragging his right leg. He collapsed onto the wooden bench by the table, his breath coming in short, hissing gasps through his teeth. Clara rushed to him. She saw it then. His heavy buckskin trousers were sliced wide open from the mid-thigh down to the knee. The leather was soaked, a dark, heavy crimson that was pooling rapidly onto the clean floorboards. "Axe slipped." He ground out his hand, gripping the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned. Hit a buried stone in the ice. Glanced off. Clara's mind went entirely blank for a fraction of a second. The metallic smell of fresh blood cut through the heavy scent of tallow. Panic roared, blinding, clawed at her throat. He was bleeding out. The invincible man was bleeding out on her floor. "Weak things die," his voice echoed in her head. She forced the panic down, burying it under a sudden, freezing focus. She didn't scream. She didn't ask if he was okay. She turned and ran to the stove. She grabbed the kettle of boiling water meant for the tea and hauled it to the table. She ran to the supply shelf, grabbing the bottle of cheap, raw whiskey they kept for medicinal purposes, a clean roll of linen bandages, and her sewing kit. Levi was watching her. His eyes were half closed, but they tracked her sharp, precise movements. "Knife," she demanded, holding out her hand. He pulled the heavy hunting knife from his belt and handed it to her, handle first. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed the torn edge of the buckskin and sliced upward, cutting the pant leg open entirely to expose the wound. It was deep. The axe blade had sheared through the muscle of his outer thigh, a long, jagged canyon of red meat and pooling blood. It hadn't hit the main artery. The blood was seeping heavily, not spurting, but it was bad enough.
"Hold still,"
she ordered. Her voice sounded foreign to her, harsh, commanding. She uncorked the whiskey with her teeth and poured a generous amount directly into the open wound. Levi's entire body went rigid. A low, guttural roar ripped from his throat, a sound of pure animal pain. His massive hands clamped down on the edges of the bench, his knuckles turning dead white. He didn't thrash, but the muscles in his legs corded like steel cables under the skin. Clara didn't apologize. She soaked a piece of linen in the boiling water and scrubbed the edges of the cut, wiping away the dirt and pine needles he had dragged in with him.
"It needs stitching,"
she said, not looking at his face, keeping her eyes fixed on the ragged flesh.
"It's too deep to bind."
Levi sucked in a ragged breath, his chest heaving. "Do it." She threaded her thickest needle with heavy black cotton thread. She dipped the needle in the whiskey. Her hands were shaking a fine, high-frequency tremor that made the tip of the needle vibrate. She stared at it, furious at her own weakness. Suddenly, a heavy, blood-stained hand clamped over her wrist. She looked up. Levi's face was inches from hers. The gray eyes were clouded with pain, but they held hers with an iron grip. He didn't say a word. He just held her wrist steady. The heat from his skin seeped into hers, grounding her. He trusted her. This man, who trusted nothing but the iron of his traps and the wood of his cabin, was putting his life entirely in her hands. The tremor stopped. Clara nodded once. He released her wrist. She pushed the needle through the tough, leathery skin of his thigh. Levi flinched a sharp intake of breath, but remained perfectly still. She pulled the thread tight, tying off the first knot. "One," she whispered. She went in again through the skin, across the canyon of red out the other side. "Pull tight, not too tight." She worked with mechanical precision. She detached her mind from the fact that she was sewing human flesh. She pretended she was repairing the heavy canvas tarp, pulling torn edges together to keep the wind out. The smell of copper filled her nose. Her hands were slick with his blood. 15 stitches. Ugly, thick black knots marching up his thigh like a centipede. When she tied off the final knot and snipped the thread with the knife, her shoulders dropped. The sudden release of tension made her dizzy. She grabbed the clean linen and wrapped the leg tightly, applying pressure, pinning the bandage with safety pins. She stepped back. Her hands were stained deep red. Levi let his head fall back against the log wall. He closed his eyes, his breathing slowly returning to a normal, albeit shallow, rhythm. The color was entirely gone from his face, leaving him looking like a statue carved from stone. Clara walked to the wash basin. She poured cold water from the bucket and scrubbed her hands with lye soap. The water in the basin turned pink, then red. She walked back to the table and poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a tin cup. She handed it to him. Levi opened his eyes. He took the cup, his hand shaking slightly for the first time since she had known him. He downed the whiskey in a single swallow. He looked down at his leg. The heavy bandaging was tight and professional. The bleeding had stopped. He looked up at Clara. She was standing there, her apron ruined, a smudge of blood on her cheekbone, her eyes hard and defiant. She wasn't the starving, hollow-eyed widow he had dragged up the mountain anymore. "You didn't faint," he noted, his voice a hoarse rasp. Clara picked up the bloody rags and threw them into the stove. They hissed as they hit the coals. "I told you," she said, turning back to him, meeting his gray eyes squarely. "I'm not a romantic." A slow, exhausted smile, the first she had ever seen, touched the corners of his mouth beneath the thick beard. It wasn't much, just a slight shift of the muscles, but in the dim light of the cabin, it looked like a victory. "No," Levi whispered, closing his eyes again. "You're a partner." He didn't move from the bench. Within minutes, the exhaustion and the whiskey pulled him under. He slept sitting up, his head resting against the wall. Clara didn't wake him. She took a heavy wool blanket from the bed and draped it over his massive shoulders, tucking it gently around his good leg. She added a thick log to the fire, adjusting the draft to keep it burning slow and hot through the afternoon. Then she picked up his bloodied knife, wiped it clean, and went back to rendering the tallow. The cabin was quiet again, save for the crackle of the fire and the deep, steady rhythm of his breathing. She looked down at her hands. They were clean, but she could still feel the phantom warmth of his blood on her skin. She glanced at the copper ring on her finger. The bargain had been for survival. But as she watched him sleep, Clara realized the terms had shifted. She wasn't just surviving the mountain anymore. They were conquering it together. Spring did not arrive with blooming flowers and chirping birds. It arrived with the deafening, relentless sound of water. The ice broke on the high ridges, first sending torrents of gray, freezing runoff down the granite faces. The snowpack didn't simply vanish, it rotted. It turned into a treacherous, knee-deep slush that sucked at boots and hid sharp stones. The air lost its sterile biting edge and filled with the heavy, pungent smell of wet earth, decaying pine needles, and unearthed animal carcasses that hadn't survived the freeze. Inside the cabin, the dynamic had shifted under the weight of Levi's injury. His thigh healed, but slowly. The deep muscle tear knit together with thick, angry scar tissue that pulled tight when it was cold. For the first month, he couldn't put weight on it. For a man whose entire existence was defined by motion and capability, the confinement was a cage. He sat by the stove, whittling down blocks of cedar with a fierce, quiet intensity, his jaw set in a permanent ridge of frustration. Clara became the legs of the operation. She learned the trap lines. Levi drew a map in the dirt floor with a stick, marking the creek bends and deadfalls. He explained the mechanics of the iron jaws with ruthless precision. "Don't put your fingers inside the jawline when you set the pan," he warned, watching her from the bench as she practiced with an unloaded trap. "It snaps. It shatters the bone. You're alone out there with a shattered hand. You die. Use your boot to press the spring. Lock the dog. Move slow." She learned. The first time she brought back a beaver, hauling the heavy, wet 40-pound carcass 2 miles uphill through the slush, she collapsed just inside the door, gasping for air. She expected him to take over the skinning. He didn't. He handed her the knife. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now cross-hatched with small white scars, calloused at the palms, the fingernails permanently stained with dirt and dried blood. She had lost the fragile, hollow look of the starving widow. In its place was a lean, hard-muscled resilience. She was becoming a creature of the ridge. By late May, the ground around the cabin was a sea of thick, brown mud. Levi was walking again, though with a pronounced heavy limp that he tried furiously to hide. He decided it was time she learned the rifle. It was a heavy Sharps buffalo rifle, a massive piece of walnut and blue steel that fired a slug the size of a man's thumb. "Hold it tight to the shoulder," he instructed. They stood at the edge of the timberline. He had set a chunk of white birch against a stump 50 yards away. "If you hold it loose, the recoil breaks your collarbone." Clara hoisted the heavy weapon. It weighed 12 pounds, but it felt like 50. She sighted down the long, octagonal barrel. "Breathe in," Levi murmured, standing just behind her right shoulder. "Let half of it out. Hold. Squeeze. Don't pull. Squeeze." She squeezed. The explosion shattered the mountain silence, a physical shockwave that punched her in the shoulder and kicked her backward. She stumbled, her boots slipping in the mud. Levi's large hand caught her by the waist, steadying her instantly through the cloud of acrid, sulphurous white smoke. She saw the birch block sitting untouched. She lowered the rifle. Her shoulder already throbbed with a deep, bruised ache. She looked at Levi, expecting a critique. "Flinched," he said simply. He took the rifle, cracked the breech, and handed her a fresh paper cartridge. Again, they shot until her shoulder was entirely numb, and her ears rang with a high, thin whine. On the 12th shot, the white birch block exploded into splinters. Levi nodded. "Good enough to hit meat, or a man." Clara looked up at him, wiping the black powder residue from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "Is there anyone left out here to shoot?" Levi stared down the mountain toward the valley, where the snow had completely melted, revealing the sprawling green sea of the lower pines. "Thaw brings out the scavengers," he said quietly. "Wolves, bears, and drifters who survived the winter by eating the dead." He turned back toward the cabin. "Keep the rifle loaded. Always." It wasn't a warning born of paranoia. It was the geography of the frontier. When the ice melted, the predators moved, and the cabin, with its smoke and its smell of curing meat, was a beacon. A week later, the dogs of reality barked at their door. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was the color of a hammered iron skillet, promising heavy spring rain. Levi was out back splitting firewood. The rhythmic thwack of the axe echoed off the rock face. Clara was inside, scrubbing the cast iron skillet with sand and water. The door was open to let in the warm breeze. She heard the snap of a branch. It wasn't the clean, sharp crack of deadfall under a deer's hoof. It was a clumsy, heavy sound. A human boot. She dropped the skillet. She moved instantly to the corner where the Sharp's rifle leaned against the wall. She checked the breech. A brass cartridge sat heavy in the chamber. She snapped it shut and pulled the heavy hammer back to half-cock. She stepped to the doorway, keeping her body shielded by the thick timber frame. Two men emerged from the tree line. They looked like walking corpses. Their clothes were rags of rotting wool and filthy canvas. Their faces were hollowed out dark with weeks of grime and unkempt beards. They smelled heavily of rancid sweat, stale wood smoke, and desperation. One carried an old Springfield musket. The other had a heavy revolver jammed into a rope belt. They stopped at the edge of the clearing. They saw the cabin, the smoke, the hanging meat. A primal, starving hunger lit up their sunken eyes. "Well, well," the taller one croaked. His voice was a dry rattle. "Looks like we found the high country king." Levi rounded the corner of the cabin. He held his axe in his right hand. He stopped dead, assessing the threat in a fraction of a second. He didn't look at Clara in the doorway. He kept his eyes locked on the two men. "You're off your trail," Levi said. His voice was calm, a low, dangerous rumble. "Trail washed out," the shorter man muttered, his eyes darting nervously toward the drying venison on the porch. "We found a cabin down in the valley, empty, man buried out back. Looked like whoever lived there packed up in a hurry." Followed the tracks. They had found Henry's grave. The tall man grinned, revealing a row of rotted black teeth. He looked past Levi and saw Clara standing in the shadows of the doorframe. "Looks like he took the widow, too," the man sneered. "Mighty neighborly of you, mountain man, sharing the warmth." Levi didn't react to the taunt. "Take a strip of meat from the rack and walk back down. Do it now and you keep your blood inside your bodies." The short man took a step forward, raising the musket slightly. "There's two of us. You got a bad leg, old man. Saw you limping around the woodpile. We'll take the meat, we'll take the powder, and we'll take the fire." The tall man's hand drifted toward the revolver in his rope belt. "Maybe the woman, too. It's been a long winter." The air in the clearing turned to glass. Everything stopped. Levi didn't try to draw the heavy pistol under his coat. He knew he couldn't beat a drawn gun with his bad leg anchoring him. He shifted his grip on the axe. "Clara?" Levi said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. She stepped out of the shadows. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. The cynicism that had protected her in Boston, the cold calculation that had kept her alive in the valley, snapped cleanly into a lethal focus. She raised the Sharp's rifle. She nestled the heavy walnut stock into her shoulder, exactly where the bruise had healed. She pulled the hammer to full cock with a sharp, metallic clack that sounded like a death knell in the damp air. She aimed directly at the chest of the tall man. "Hands away from the iron," she said. Her voice didn't waver. It was flat, hard, and entirely convincing. The men froze. They looked at the woman. They expected a terrified, weeping widow. They saw a killer. Her eyes were as pale and unforgiving as a frozen lake. The tall man hesitated. His pride, the stupid, violent pride of desperate men, fought against the sheer size of the bore pointing at his ribs. His hand twitched toward the pistol grip. Clara breathed in, let half out, held. She squeezed the trigger. The Sharps roared a massive gout of flame and white smoke erupting from the muzzle. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but she braced her back leg and absorbed it. The heavy slug hit the tall man dead center of mass. The impact lifted him entirely off his feet and threw him backward into the mud. He didn't scream. He was dead before his shoulders hit the ground. The short man screamed in panic. He swung the heavy musket toward Clara, his finger jerking the trigger. Click. A misfire. Damp powder. Levi lunged. He ignored the screaming pain in his scarred thigh. He closed the 10 feet between them in 2 massive strides. He swung the axe handle, not the blade. The thick hickory wood caught the man squarely in the jaw. The bone shattered with a sickening crunch. The man collapsed, dropping the useless musket. He rolled in the mud, clutching his ruined face, gagging on his own blood and broken teeth. Levi stood over him. He dropped the axe. He pulled the heavy hunting knife from his belt. The man looked up, his eyes wide with a sudden absolute terror. He raised his hand in a pathetic, pleading gesture. Levi looked at the man. Then he looked at Clara. She was standing on the porch. She had lowered the rifle. The barrel was smoking. She looked at the writhing man in the mud. She felt no pity. This man would have killed Levi. He would have dragged her into the dirt. She gave Levi a single, short nod, the exact same nod he had given her when she gutted the rabbit. Levi dropped to his knees. The knife flashed once, a quick, brutal arc across the throat. The screaming stopped. The clearing fell silent again, save for the first heavy drops of spring rain hitting the cedar shakes of the roof. The rain turned heavy, washing the blood into the mud, turning the earth around the cabin into a thick, rusty mire. They dragged the bodies a quarter-mile down the ridge into a deep, rocky ravine where the wolves would handle the rest. Digging graves in the granite bench was impossible, and Levi wasn't going to waste the effort on scavengers. When they returned to the cabin, they were both soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and the coppery stench of violence. Levi barred the door. The sound of the heavy timber slotting into place was a physical weight lifting off the room. He walked to the stove and fed the fire until it roared, throwing a fierce orange heat into the damp air. Clara leaned the empty rifle in the corner. She didn't look at it. She walked to the wash basin. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline had burned away, leaving a hollow, freezing ache in her chest. She had killed a man. She had watched another slaughtered at her feet. And the most terrifying part was that she felt absolutely no remorse. She only felt safe. She poured water from the kettle into the basin. It steamed in the cool air. She picked up a sliver of lye soap and began to scrub her hands. She scrubbed violently, scraping the skin over her knuckles until it was raw and red. Heavy footsteps approached behind her. Levi didn't say a word. He reached out and gently took her hands, pulling them away from the harsh soap. "Enough," he said quietly. He took a clean linen cloth, dipped it in the warm water, and carefully wiped the mud and powder residue from her knuckles, her palms, and her wrists. His touch was incredibly light, a stark contrast to the brutal violence his hands had just committed. Clara stood perfectly still. The cynical wall, the final layer of defense she had built up against the world, fractured.
I'm not a good woman,
she whispered, staring blindly at the wooden wall.
A good woman would be crying.
Levi stopped wiping her hands. He turned her slowly to face him. His gray eyes, usually so guarded, were entirely open. They held a profound, echoing understanding. He looked at the hard lines of her face, the smudge of dirt on her chin, the copper ring sitting dull and unpolished on her scarred finger. A good woman would be dead in the valley, Levi said, his voice a low rumble vibrating in his chest. I didn't marry a good woman. I married a mountain woman. He dropped the cloth into the basin. He didn't step back. He reached up his massive, calloused fingers, gently tracing the line of her sharp cheekbone, brushing a wet strand of hair behind her ear. It was the first time he had touched her purely for the sake of touch. You held the door, he said softly.
You bought the time,
she replied, her voice thick. He leaned down. It wasn't a sweeping, cinematic kiss. It was an anchoring. His lips pressed against hers, warm, rough tasting of rain and woods. It was a seal on a contract, forged in survival and sealed in blood. It was a promise that as long as the mountain stood, they would hold the line together. Clara closed her eyes. She leaned her weight against him, feeling the solid, immovable strength of his chest. For the first time since she had stepped off a train in Wyoming a lifetime ago, she wasn't cold, she wasn't starving, and she wasn't alone. Summer arrived on the high ridge with a sudden, violent burst of green. The lodgepole pines threw off their heavy winter coats, and the mountain meadows exploded with brilliant blue lupine and yellow arrowleaf. The cabin doors stayed open. The smell of curing meat was replaced by the scent of sun-baked pine needles and fresh mountain mint. Levi was out by the chopping block, preparing the winter stack. A man who understood the mountain knew that winter started the day summer began. The rhythmic swing of his axe was a metronome of their existence. The limp was still there, but it no longer slowed him down. It was just another scar, another piece of the terrain they had navigated. Clara sat on the front porch. She was mending a heavy canvas pack, her needle moving with swift, practiced efficiency. The Sharp's rifle sat loaded, leaning against the doorframe, within arm's reach. It always would be. She paused, looking out over the sprawling, endless expanse of the valley below. Far down where the heat haze shimmered over the flats, the world was moving. Trains were running. Towns were growing. Men were lying and stealing and building things where they shouldn't. She didn't miss a single part of it. She looked down at her left hand. The copper ring caught the bright summer sun, flashing with a warm, fiery brilliance. It was no longer a symbol of a desperate bargain. It was a badge of honor. She heard Levi stop chopping. He buried the axe head in the stump and wiped his brow with the back of his arm. He turned and looked at her sitting on the porch. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He just gave her that single, short nod. Clara nodded back. She picked up her needle, drove it through the tough canvas, and pulled the thread tight. The fire was lit, and it would never go out. Love on the frontier isn't built on poetry or stolen glances. It's forged in blood, gunpowder, and the shared warmth of a cast-iron stove. Clara and Levi's story proves that sometimes the most profound romance is simply choosing to survive together against a world that wants you dead. If this gritty tale of the American frontier captured your imagination, if you felt the cold bite of the wind and heard the rifle crack, be sure to like this story and subscribe for more journeys into the untamed West. Turn on notifications so you never miss another tale from the high country.